Hey guys, welcome to year 3 of the annual fitness test. Every year since I turned 35, I've been completing a series of mostly physical challenges to see how well I'm aging. I would love it if you joined in at home, which is why I've been slowly creating a series of how-to videos for everything you'll see here. They can be found with a link in the description below. There is also a link to a spreadsheet with the same table I use to record my results. Where possible, I've tried to include normative data so you can see how you compare to others of a similar age and sex. I appreciate that not everyone is willing to do 25 tests on themselves every year, so I've thought about what a condensed version would look like, and I'll flag those essential tests as we go. This really is a long-term project, so if you find it interesting, you'd like to follow along, please do subscribe to my channel. Let's start with general health. General health measurements might not be as exciting as VO2 max or vertical jump, but they are a really important foundation of your health and so shouldn't be overlooked. Most of these tests can be done at home, meaning today could be the first day that you start tracking these things, finding out where you're strong and where you need to improve. I'll start with a simple one, my weight. Following university, I was keeping fit by playing rugby, where it helps to be a bit heavier. These days, I've taken up sprinting again, and I consciously keep my weight down. So this year, I was under 70 kilos. I'm very disciplined in the way that I count calories and regularly weigh myself, which means I feel almost in complete control of which direction my weight moves. If your weight is potentially creeping up each year, then absolutely start weighing yourself. Weekly or monthly is ideal, but even once a year is more than a lot of people do, and it helps keep you accountable. Moving on to waist measurements, these tend to follow a similar pattern to weight. Your waist size is an indication of the level of unhealthy visceral fat around your internal organs, and again, you could literally go find a tape measure and measure your waist right now. If you want to know more about any one of these metrics, you should be able to find either a YouTube video, an article on my website, or both. Throughout this process, I'm constantly learning, listening to health podcasts, reading research papers, and that means I sometimes add or remove certain tests. This is the first year I'm officially dropping BMI, body mass index, as a useful measure. The muscle you carry is so important that BMI on its own has very little relevance anymore. Instead, I'm using electronic scales to measure body fat, and from that I'm tracking something called FFMI, Fat-Free Mass Index. It's calculated in a similar way to BMI, but you don't include your fat. A quick worked example, if someone is 1.8 meters tall, 80 kilos and 25% body fat, then their BMI would be calculated like this. If you deduct the 25% fat, you have 60 kilos of lean mass, and that number is used to calculate FFMI, which in this case is 18.5. So, despite being on the high end of normal for BMI, in this example, the man is on the low end of average for muscle mass. The loss of muscle mass with age, known as sarcopenia, may be hidden within BMI because the person might weigh the same every year, but their body composition is slowly shifting to a higher percentage of fat. Studies have shown the decrease in muscle mass to be around 0.5% per year after the age of 30, though this speeds up after the age of 60, so monitoring body fat is another really important measure. If you don't have body fat scales, which aren't always reliable, you can get an estimate by looking at example body fat images online. If you want the highest level of accuracy, you can get something called a DEXA scan, though this can cost several £100s. You can see that my FFMI is trending downwards because while I'm losing weight, I'm also losing some muscle. And while I like to think of myself as muscular, my muscle mass is in the mid-range of average for a man. Another boring but essential measurement is blood pressure. Hypertension is very common, and you can get a medically approved at-home cuff for under £30. I've taken the average of left and right arms here. The general threshold for healthy blood pressure is 120/80. So you can see I've had slightly elevated numbers in the past despite regular exercise, no smoking and no drinking. If you're watching this video thinking, I'm not as healthy as this guy, then please go get your blood pressure checked. For lung function, I've been using something called peak flow, which is how strongly you can exhale through a tube. This needs to be assessed relative to sex, height and age. So you can see 3 trends if you look at the normative data. Normal for a woman is lower than a man. The taller you are, the higher you should score. And after peaking at age 35, there's a steady decline. Measurement is with a Minirite peak flow meter, which costs around £10. Finally, a few blood markers. Firstly, HbA1c, useful in the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. Then CRP, a measure of inflammation. And lastly, LDL cholesterol, historically known as the bad cholesterol, but these days we know it's more nuanced than that. Each one has an optimal range. I borrowed some from Dr. Peter Attia, who strongly encourages the tracking of blood markers in his book Outlive. So, HbA1c, ideally trying to stay between 31 and 37. You could argue mine has been trending up for the last 5 years, so it's something for me to keep an eye on. Then C-reactive protein, anything under 1 milligram per litre is optimal, and it's something I believe my diet and active lifestyle helps keep under control. Low-grade inflammation is something that is so closely tied to the aging process that people use the term inflammaging, so my track history of low scores is no guarantee that it will stay that way. For LDL cholesterol, the marker I'm really interested in is called apolipoprotein B, or ApoB for short. LDL and ApoB correlate quite well, but when one is high and the other is low, it's ApoB that is the best predictor of cardiovascular risk. As for the optimal range, Peter Attia suggests under 0.62 grams per litre, but he's a bit of an outlier in terms of his aggressive stance on ApoB, so until I learn more, I'm happy staying underneath 1. Personally, I would say every single one of these is important to track over time, that's why I've chosen them, and they have some of the strongest correlations to preventable diseases and health conditions. Depending on your healthcare service, you may already have these monitored as part of your annual health check, but if not, I'd encourage you to start tracking them yourself. Next up are the tests related to fitness and cardiovascular health. One of the most interesting things I learned this year was that the often quoted steady declines in fitness, muscle, or strength with age are often anything but. What ends up looking smooth at the population level, when seen at the individual level, often involves someone maintaining nicely for several years, then having some sort of acute event like injury or prolonged inactivity, where they might lose a few percentage points in a matter of months. This is the first year I'm measuring resting heart rate based on the supposed best practice, which is lying down straight after waking up in the morning. Prior to that, I was taking it the same time blood pressure was done, which was in the middle of the day after a few minutes sitting still. I'm going to track both because I feel like it's more common for people to measure it seated, and I'd rather take the higher value when comparing myself to the normative data, though either way I end up as an athlete. If you've been sitting still watching this video up to this point, then you could pause it, count your pulse for a minute, and then see how you compare for your age on this chart. A good place to find your pulse is the side of your neck or the thumb side of your wrist. If you could only measure one thing in the fitness category, it should be VO2 max. This is a measure of cardiovascular fitness and a strong predictor of longevity. Personally, I try to do several estimated VO2 max tests and take the average. If you've never done one before, the Rockport walking test is a really nice starting point as it only involves a 1-mile walk. On the more intense side is something like the Cooper test, which is a 12-minute run for maximum distance, and that's if you really want to push yourself. Over time, you want to be looking at both absolute and relative values. It helps to know where you are relative to those of your age and sex, but in absolute terms, once you start falling below around 25, your activities of daily living are going to be that much more difficult. You can also see where you are on a percentile chart and use that to predict what age you'll be when you fall below that threshold. Another one tied to longevity is grip strength. I'll cover maximum grip strength later on. What I have in the fitness section is closer to grip endurance, and that is hanging from a bar for as long as you can, known as a dead hang. While there are plenty of research papers tying grip strength to all-cause mortality, unfortunately there's no real dead hang standards to compare times to, so I can't sit here and tell you what a good score is. From what I have read, it seems like 60 seconds is a decent amount of time. A second isometric test I do is the front plank. This one is to measure core strength, important for athleticism, but also balance as you get older. 3.5 minutes puts me firmly in the above average category. Again, there's not enough data to start saying what it should look like with age. Lastly, some breath holding, both in and out. Holding on the out breath is a measure of something called CO2 tolerance, which is an indication of your efficiency breathing day to day, as well as aerobic capacity. I only learned about this a few months ago, so this is the first year that I'm measuring it. Holding on the in-breath is something people may be more familiar with. This measures different qualities like the ability to store and utilize oxygen and overall lung capacity. There are several breathing-related issues known collectively as COPD, which affect something like 250 million people worldwide. So while it's a very basic test, it's important to continually assess yourself. An average score for holding the in-breath would be around 45 seconds, while under 30 seconds would be considered poor. For safety, maximum breath holding should never be practiced in water. Next up are what I consider to be the fun tests, which are strength and power, though it also includes muscular endurance. I've been listening to a lot of Dr. Andy Galpin in the last year, and he suggested that tests like these should have both a consistent warm-up and, where applicable, be on a set tempo. So these were done following a set warm-up routine, which you'll find in the description below. Push-ups are to a tempo of 50 beats a minute, with a pause at the bottom and the top, meaning 25 push-ups per minute. The test stops once you can no longer stick to the tempo. I was very pleased with this year's result of 46 push-ups. In 2023, I tested only a month or two after completing a push-up program, and that saw me hit 50 reps, whereas this year I've not done any specific training for it. That puts me in the 90th percentile for my age bracket, which you can see is equivalent to someone 20 years older than me doing 30 push-ups. I'll quickly flash up the table for women, which is based on a modified push-up from the knees. I've got 2 upper body and 2 lower body tests in this section, and while they are quite entertaining to try, I wouldn't consider them essential tests. If you can, maybe do 1 upper and 1 lower body just to see how you're doing for your age. Another test with a set tempo is pull-ups. This time it's a slower 30 beats a minute, meaning 15 pull-ups a minute. That may seem like a very slow pace, but it's about finding a tempo that isn't too fast when you're really fatigued. I'm trending in the right direction, and despite completing a pull-up program in October 2022 that took me to 25 pull-ups, by the time June rolled around, I was back down to 14, which shows you just how important consistency is when it comes to strength training. Women are sometimes assessed with a flexed arm hang, otherwise it becomes harder to categorize by ability because there's plenty of women who can only do between 0 and 3 pull-ups. Since anyone with a space on the floor can do push-ups, that would be my suggested choice of exercise if you're only going to do one of these. For lower body power, I have 2 tests, a broad jump and a vertical jump. These are quite explosive, so they require a thorough warm-up, and they are assessed as a best of 3 jumps. This is one to be careful of, as landing on a hard surface could lead to injury. If you choose to do it on a slightly softer surface like grass, just make sure it's not slippery. Andy Galpin suggests an absolute baseline ability of being able to broad jump your height. While if you look online, then jumping around 2.5 meters, just over 8 feet, is excellent for a man, and 2 meters is excellent for a woman. The vertical jump involves the same dynamic warm-up, so it makes sense to do this at the same time as the broad jump if you plan to do both. These tests have an element of coordination, so you could find yourself jumping further or higher simply from practicing the movement more regularly. The simplest way to test is to find an outdoor wall and use chalk to mark your reach, then again to mark your maximum jump, and then measure the distance between the two. Average here is around 19 inches for men and 15 for women, though I haven't seen any age-related standards. Last but certainly not least of the strength and power is grip strength. This is another good predictor of longevity and one I'd strongly encourage you to track as you age. I've had my Camry hand grip dynamometer for 7 or 8 years, so it's worth the £30 investment, even if you only track yourself once a year. I make my whole family do this one. My parents are both on the high end of normal for their age, as am I. Mine comes from weight training, whereas these days my parents' grip is strengthened through gardening, so don't feel you need to be in the gym to improve your grip. The final category is one I've been struggling with in terms of what test to choose, and that is cognitive decline. Some of the official tests are clearly suited to more obvious declines like early stage dementia. What I'm looking for is something that will differentiate a 30-year-old from a 40-year-old. I've been using a website called Quantified Mind, but any other suggestions, please let me know. This one consists of a battery of 11 different tests, including memory, verbal, and spatial skills. And while my overall score is trending up, it varies a lot by test. So that is it for another year. In previous years, I've been trying to cram all these tests into one bumper weekend, but this year I spread them out more evenly across my weekly routine. If you're looking for the essentials, I would say blood pressure, body fat and weight to calculate fat-free mass index, taking a blood test for HbA1c, CRP, and cholesterol, doing at least one estimated VO2 max test, and measuring maximum grip strength are some of the most important biomarkers when considering health, fitness, and longevity. As I say, I'm in the process of making tutorial videos for every test. The next step would be to explore how you could go about improving each one. So if any of that sounds exciting, then please subscribe and follow along. Thanks for watching.